I'm going to show you 3 different variations on ways to make units like these. The first thing I want you to notice is that these are mirror images. So you do need to pay attention while you're working with it no matter which method you're using. So move these up here. So the pattern told me what size rectangle to cut. It was 3 by 1 3/4. And then the squares that we're going to use to take the corners off, they're going to be the same size as the width of our rectangle, so 1 3/4. So I'm going to go ahead and leave these sitting here so you can see the angle that they're going, because I do need to pay attention because I need pairs of these. I have my 1 3/4 inch square and I have marked a diagonal line from point to point. I'm going to place that right sides together with my rectangle. So on this one I would be going this way on the seam. So on my other one I want to make sure I'm going this way. And I'm going to match up the short edge and also the square on the long edges. Then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew like a thread's width inside the seam allowance. So that would be toward the corner, not toward the side, not toward this side where my rectangle is hanging out. So I'll be sewing just a thread width away from the line in here. That is so that when I flip my square up, there's room for it to fold over the thread, because that does take up space when I'm pressing. Once I've sewn the squares on, I'm going to press toward the square, and now I'm going to trim off what's behind that square or the triangle that flips up. So just take the seam allowance off. And there's my finished units. Again, you need to pay attention so you're getting mirror imaged pairs. So this ruler is called the folded corner clipper. What it does is it eliminates having to mark the line and trims all in one step, and you do it before you sew. So remember, I'm doing mirror images, so I have stacked my rectangles up. They can either be right sides together or wrong sides together, and cut them in pairs, and I'm going to leave them that way when I'm cutting. I'm still going to be using squares in this case. I'm just going to stack them up on top of my rectangles so that I can cut them all at once. And once I have done that, then I'm going to line this ruler up so that I get the flat end up on the top corner. I'm coming down here, and there's my 1 3/4 mark, because that's what my square is, and I have my 1 3/4 mark over here on this line, and I could also check down here for my 3-inch mark to make sure everything's nice and straight. And then I'm going to cut that corner off. Now if I was just doing one thing at a time, I wouldn't have to move anything, but since I'm making sure, when I cut this way, I make sure that I keep my mirror image. Go this, and then here. And now what I'm going to do is sew my 1/4 inch seam from that edge. After sewing my squares on, I pressed toward the square, and that finishes it up. So I'm getting exactly the same units, just using the corner clipper. I don't have to mark, sew, and then trim afterwards. I'm sure you've noticed that with all the methods we've used, we are wasting a little fabric off the end. And even this method, we're going to waste a little. But again, I have a pair together, either right sides together or wrong sides together. And this time I'm showing you the easy angle tool. And I'm going to line that up. My strip was 1 3/4 wide, so I have my 1 3/4 mark here, and it was 3 inches long, so I have my 3-inch mark here. And I'm going to go ahead and cut this triangle off. Okay, so it gives me the same shape as I got with the wing clipper, but I don't have to cut all my squares that way. I can go with a 1 3/4 inch strip. It's awkward here with the camera. Go this way. Do a 1 3/4 inch strip. And I've already squared off this end. So I can cut my half square triangle units just out of the strip rather than cutting squares. So I'm lining my 1 3/4 mark up with the long edge. I'm lining up the straight edge of my ruler with my straight edge. Cut. I'm going to move this one out of the way. I am cutting in pairs. You could certainly cut singly if you want to. Then I'm going to flip the ruler around. Again, my 1 3/4 mark goes on my long edge, and my straight edge of the ruler, the diagonal this time, is on my cut edge, and cut. And I can just work down my strip, cutting my half square triangle units. Now I like to go ahead and nub off the other point. So I've got my 1 3/4 mark here, and cut. And then this one, my 1 3/4 inch mark here. Now the nice thing about this is if you're doing a lot of blocks and you have, say, a square that goes with the triangles, you're cutting your square and your triangles out of the exact same width of fabric. So we only need 2 of these. I'm going to put these guys out, and these are going to go with it. We're going to just flip it over, and again we're going to sew on that 1/4 inch. That 1/4 inch from our diagonal edge, and from here on out it works exactly the same thing as the folded corner clipper did. It's just I'm not wasting fabric off my squares every time. Same unit, 3 different ways. You just need to find the one that you like the best and that you get the best result with. I'm going to show you a couple of ways to make a pentagon shape, or it looks like a rooftop. So in this case I have a 3-inch square, and I have 2 1 3/4 inch squares, and on the wrong side of the 1 3/4 inch square I marked a line from point to point, just one of them. So I'm going to line that up so that my line is running to the center of the square, not into the point, and then I'm going to sew just a thread's width into the seam allowance, so out toward the corner along that line. Once I've stitched, I press toward the triangle out away from the middle, and we're going to trim off our extra fabric underneath that. So we're going to cut 1/4 inch from that. Remember, we're cutting out toward the triangle, not on the other side of it, or you'll be cutting new pieces. So now I'm going to take my second square, and it just needs to be going. It doesn't matter which corner as long as it's going to end up touching the one that I just put in. I'm going to line it up along the sides here and here. And again, the line is going across the corner, not into the corner, and I will sew just a thread's width toward the corner. After sewing, I once again flipped it over and pressed out toward the corner. And again, I'm going to trim off my seam allowance, leaving about 1/4. So that's making the pentagon by drawing lines on your small squares. So if you're just tired of marking those lines on the small squares, you could use a folded corner clipper on this. I have put my small square on top of the bigger square, right sides together, and then I can take my folded corner clipper, and this square was 1 3/4, so I can line my 1 3/4 mark here, here. This should be lining up with the flat edge up here, and I can double check everything because I know the square was 3 inches, so I can make sure I have 3 inches down on the bottom as well. And I'm going to cut off the corner. I'm only going to cut 1 corner at a time because it just makes it easier that way. So I'll go and sew my 1/4 inch here. I pressed toward my colored or my small triangle. Now I'm going to put my next square on a corner that's connecting to this one. We want the fabric to meet in the middle. And just going to line everything up along this edge and along that edge. Then I'm going to do exactly the same thing I did last time. I'm going to line up my 1 3/4 mark here and here, here, and then I can check it with the 3-inch mark down on the bottom. And then I will cut this off. and sew my 1/4 inch seam there. I once again pressed out toward the small triangle, and that's my finished pentagon unit. As you can see, we are wasting this much fabric for each one of these. So let me show you another method. I'm still going to be wasting off of the big square, but I don't have to do as much. I don't have to waste it off the small one. So I'm still using a 3-inch square for my big square. And then I have a 1 3/4 inch strip of what I'm using for my corners. And I'm going to once again use my easy angle. So I'm lining up the 1 3/4 mark down here on the bottom. I'm going to clean up my short edge so that it's straight. And then, oops, before I didn't have to move it yet there. I want that lined up along here and along this edge. I'm going to cut a triangle off, and I am cutting in pairs, so I will be speeding things up. So that would take care of one pentagon unit. Then I flip my ruler over, line up the 1 3/4 mark with the bottom line and the long diagonal with the cut edge, and cut. And I can just keep cutting however many I need. And I do like to go ahead and nub off the long corners. The tripod's in the way. I would rather not move them around any more than I have to. So I'm lining up with my 1 3/4 mark here, and I should be with the cut edge there. Cut. I'm going to do the same thing on this one. Since I'm working in pairs, I do want to make sure that they stay stacked up evenly. That's why I would prefer not to move it. So really should be using a smaller cutting mat and picking it up and rotating it, or using an actual rotating cutting mat. Okay, so now I'm going to combine this with the folded corner clipper. I'm going to, and this is a little bit trickier, so think about it before you decide you want to do this. I'm going to line my 1 3/4 mark up here on this edge. I don't have the square in here to line up with. I'm going to line up the nubbed edge with the top, and I can also check to make sure my 3-inch line is going across the bottom. And then I can just cut off one corner, and I'm only going to do one at a time. Then I'm going to take one of my triangle units and line it up with the edge here, here, and that long angle, and then sew my 1/4 inch. Just like on all the other methods, I pressed out toward the triangle. And now I need to cut it off either this corner or this one. Doesn't make any difference which one. So I can line up, again, my 1 3/4 mark with the edge. Nothing to line it up with here. My nubbed edge with the edge of the 3-inch, and I can put my 3-inch line down here just to try to keep everything squared up. I'm going to cut off that corner. Then I will take my other half square triangle unit and line it up, matching my long edges and my short edges, and stitch a 1/4 inch. All 3 pentagons look exactly the same when they're finished. They're just slight variations on how they're made. So you need to decide which one gives you the best results. Or do you want to just use your square and rectangle ruler? Do you want to save fabric? Those are all things you need to decide on which is most important to you.